Hey folks, welcome to Narratives. Narratives is a podcast exploring the ways in which the world is better than in the past, the ways it is worse, and the paths towards a better, more definite vision of the future. I'm your host, Will Jarvis, and I want to thank you for taking the time out of your day to listen to this episode. I hope you enjoy it. You can find show notes, transcripts, and videos at narrativespodcast.com. Well, David, how are you doing this afternoon?
I'm well, thanks. How are you?
Doing great. Thank you so much for taking time to come on the show. Do you mind giving us a brief bio and some of the big ideas you're interested in?
Brief bio. I'm an American living in the UK. I've been here for about a decade now. I've had a slightly weird journey. I started my career as a high school dropout in finance for 4 years. Then started a business in Europe in 2006 that I sold in 2008. Made enough money to think about giving most of it away, and got pretty frustrated by the state of play in the charity sector, and decided I probably needed to learn more. And at 25, went to university for the first time, and turns out I like learning as an adult, and ended up coming to the UK a decade ago to work on a PhD, which I dropped out of to start Founders Pledge. And that's what I do now. And I've been doing that for the last 8 or so years, 7.5 years. And big ideas. I'm really interested in how we can coordinate better to solve really tough problems. I mean, if you look at the news these days, all I tend to see is just doom and gloom, and how increasingly precarious the balance we have on this planet is. And I don't just mean about climate, but I mean in lots of respects. On the same token, you have we've never been better off as a people, as a species before. We've never had better health, more happiness. All of the big indicators are getting better in lots of respects, but yet there are still this precariousness. And so I think that there's a really interesting space for really smart people to coordinate better as they think about how to apply resources for tough problems. And so I'm excited about that. It's sort of what I do at Founders Pledge and what we do at Founders Pledge. So I'm interested in how we leverage communities of exceptional people to do good stuff.
That's great. That's great. You remind me of a question there I've had for a while, which is, it seems like humanity has in some sense gotten worse at coordinating around big problems. I think in context of Apollo and the Manhattan Project, where we were able to build these incredibly technically difficult things, we weren't even sure they were quite possible in very short periods of time. But it seems like it's almost impossible to imagine the Department of Energy, which it was actually the Manhattan Project originally, doing that again, the same thing. It sounds like it just seems like it just wouldn't work. What do you think has gone wrong there? And how do you think about fixing that kind of problem?
It's a really good question, and actually one that we've been thinking about along with a bunch of other funders in the space that are trying to harken back to these times gone past, where humanity could seemingly accomplish these incredible feats in small periods of time. And I think it's a question of willpower, and the Manhattan Project and the Apollo missions were a sort of a great power balancing act, right? Where you had the entire might and will of the US government and a relatively in line political class just deciding to throw their weight behind this idea so that America could best the Soviets, right? And in the Apollo sense, and defeat Nazism in the Manhattan Project sense. So it's good that we don't have threats like that anymore, or the type of sort of monolithic thinking in that respect that enables a country like the US or Europe to go about sometimes scary types of things. The Manhattan Project was scary. But it also has meant that we've really not made big advances in areas that seemingly would unlock a huge amount of good for the world. And one of the funders that we've been impressed by recently, who's been thinking about this, is Schmidt Futures, which is Eric Schmidt's family office that has a big focus on impact. And we've been exploring with them these so-called foundational research offices, FROs. Actually, that's not FROs. I don't think I'm getting O right. Foundational research organizations. Sorry, that are basically looking into setting up Manhattan Project style projects for various issues. And so I think it's a question of like a meaningful amount of money and good coordination between aligned actors deciding to say, we're just going to sort of throw caution to the wind and fund stuff that we think is going to be transformational for society.
That's great. I'm curious, is there another element that matters, so when we think about these big mega projects, you mentioned something interesting, right? The great power conflict element to it seems to me to be really important. So this idea, like you and I, David, if we were Manhattan Project scientists and General Groves comes to us and he's like, you need to work really hard, because if you don't work really hard, we're going to lose this war and it's going to be terrible. And the Nazis are going to come over and they're going to take over this country. And that was the story at the time, is they're going to invade, North America and eventually come down, wherever you were. Do you think it's and we've had Adam Marblestone on the show as well, so this is a great connection from the FRO angle. Is it difficult, if you spin up an FRO for, let's say, fertility research, if you don't have this kind of human adversary you're worried about that forces you to work, doesn't force you, but it encourages you to work 80 hours a week on this project, do people just not work as hard? Is there a way to inspire people to work really hard on these problems that are incredibly important, maybe as important as the problems the Manhattan Project was solving and Apollo were solving, but don't have this kind of human enemy element that, in my mind, sounds like and seems really important to encourage people scares people into working really hard, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I'm not sure. The example that I thought of and then laughed about, because it's going to be, I guess, slightly controversial, is like, we've seen people be motivated to work 80-hour weeks and through weekends on big projects. They tend to be led by Elon Musk, right? So you think about SpaceX and Tesla and just how these two industries have been fundamentally disrupted by this guy who basically inspires action without that threat of extinction,
Armageddon,
right?
Yeah,
right. But through, I'm not sure what. So I guess more Elon might be the answer in some respects, and less in lots of others. I'm not really sure. That's the truth. And I guess maybe it is a bit of if we don't do this soon, we're like heading into a brick wall. Except the brick wall is not brick. It's like a big, huge metal wall that's, several meters thick, and it's very hot, and we're not going to survive a crash with it.
Exactly.
And we're sort of heading in that direction in a lot of respects. I just don't think everyone has realized it or really internalized it yet to the extent that would compel people to work those 80, 100-hour weeks,
right?
In the way that might be necessary to develop foundational new technologies.
Absolutely. Well, I have a question. I'm going to jump around a little bit on the outline. I'm sorry,
Sure.
but it is aligned here. How concerned are you about AI safety, AI risk? It does seem to me like one of the big problems in the AI safety space is a lack of coordination. There is no Manhattan Project for AI safety research. And perhaps if we could coordinate everyone better in some sense, I feel like our odds are better. And it's not like where Yudkowsky's kind of writing these blog posts where he's kind of given up and says, at least in my mind, that's how I read it, that we don't really have a chance. I think we should try really hard to make sure AI safety goes right and AI alignment goes well. And it seems like a coordination problem at some level.
It's definitely a coordination problem. And I am, I don't, maybe the theme of this conversation so far is I'm not sure, but
I'm a difficult question.
I'm not feeling super optimistic from my perspective, and I'm certainly not an expert in AI safety in the way that Eliezer is, or any of the other much smarter people thinking about this. What I do understand is that the people focused on AI safety research are dwarfed by the people focused on developing AI as quickly as possible. And the difference in budget, scale, and ambition is hard to fathom between the ones that want to develop AI quickly, regardless of safety concerns, and those who want to do it safely. It's two different leagues.
Yeah.
And when you think about, let's just constrain it to the West for very very briefly, and then we'll sort of expand that that sphere that we talk about. Like even the West, where you have a relatively aligned political institution group and a relatively aligned economic set of incentives, it still is just seemingly intractable to get people to talk to each other. And this is, and we're talking about developing commercial uses for AI. I don't see how we can coordinate that better, absent some new piece of information, some extant something happening that really rallies people together. I'm not sure what it is. We can throw money at it. We can throw AI safety researchers at it. We'd be much better with like 5 more Eliezers. But like, that's not going to happen. Right. If you expand the sphere to think about China, then it becomes a fundamentally different question, because it's not about AI for commercial use. It's AI for dominion.
Right.
I'm mentioning Eric Schmidt again, but his views on this have been pretty eye-opening, mind-expanding. Just his view on China is they are developing AI at a breakneck pace because who develops it first wins everything, right? And call that what you will, but they are throwing a huge amount of brain power at it, a huge amount of money, with no real, as I understand it, question of safety. And that's very scary to me.
Well, is it a question then, if you're the American president, if you're Joe Biden, do you just, say, Gudkowski, like, please stop, please stop, but we want this first? If it's going to be primarily defensive, how do you, is the U.S. government in this kind of public choice dilemma, like kind of encouraged to just like, not fund any AI safety research? We need to be the first ones to get it, because if the first one gets it wins, then, we're really in trouble, and if AI safety, if everyone in the field thinks it's really not possible to line these things, it's just like, well, we're going to let the chips play out. That's not a very, rosy picture. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think it's maybe a potentially a false dichotomy. Like the Chinese view is like those who get it first win, and and sort of the more EA view would be those who get it first, everyone loses, right? Like it's not like a winners take all. It's everyone loses except for the AI, right? So I think it would be probably not smart to stop AI safety research.
Right,
I think
exactly.
If anything, we should. The goal of that research should be, I would expect better communication between the various labs working on this. And I mean, if you look at Meticulous, the forecast for sort of AI timelines has gone down like very significantly recently. And I'm certainly not an expert. Like, again, not an expert. If I could wear the hat, I would say not an expert on it. But like lots of people are, and I trust those people. And it seems to me that we're fast approaching either that brick/metal wall or a very large cliff of some variety.
Definitely. And do you guys support any AI safety, AI alignment researchers at Founders Pledge?
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, all of the usual suspects. We are big believers in the need to put lots of philanthropic dollars to work to focus on developing safe AI, or slowing down the development of AI, aligning incentives in these types of systems, as well as all of the sort of biosecurity and broad X risk areas. I mean, we've also done research on lethal autonomous weaponized systems. We've just put out. We've done research on that we published at the end of last year on preventing great power war, which we also consider to be part of this long-termist worldview, bucket of funding opportunities, and the representation of future generations in democratic institutions today.
That's cool. How do you think about, ranking these interventions, evaluating new cause areas? Do you guys have a framework you use at Founders Pledge to try and figure out what's the best, highest leverage things to fund?
Yeah, it's a relatively complicated question, actually. So I'll maybe sort of walk you through it, and we could stop at various places. Yeah. But it's going to sound pretty sort of cut of the standard cloth at the start. And we start, and that start is we try to prioritize the world's problems based on importance, relative neglectedness, and our ability to actually make a meaningful difference to them. And neglected in this framework is really sort of shorthand for the question, could a philanthropist add value in this space? And one way to approximate the question is to look at the scale of the problem and see how much money is being spent on it by philanthropists relative to its scale. And indeed, we do this a lot of the time. So to give a sense of how this might work, and to tie it back to one of the things I just mentioned, I'll point to an example in our recent report on lethal autonomous weaponized systems, which our research suggests poses a pretty meaningful threat to global stability and could be a causal pathway to a nuclear exchange or other form of great power conflict. And the strategic stability risk posed by autonomous weapons largely takes the form of government spending on these systems. So in 2021, for example, the U.S. Department of Defense requested $1.7 billion to work on autonomous weapons. And on the other side, philanthropic funding in the space is only about $2.5 million a year. So the ratio of philanthropic to military investment is around 1 to 680. And we can stack that up against cybersecurity, for instance, where the ratio is 1 to 62. So autonomous weapons are philanthropically neglected relative to cyber issues. And also, to take a step back, more generally, since we think $2.5 million is not very much to spend for an issue with potential catastrophic consequences, just not enough money.
Yeah.
But we don't always do sort of a neglectedness exercise this way. And the question isn't always how much money is being spent, but sometimes is the money being spent wisely? And the work we do in climate, for example, is indicative of this. And the reason that we work in climate is, despite the fact that there's $600 billion being spent on it annually, is we think there's a good reason to think that that money is either misspent, or at the least the tendency in the climate space is for the next dollar to very likely be misspent. So an example, quickly. Carbon removal plays a really big role in many of the IPCC emission scenarios that keep the world under that 2-degree warming over pre-industrial levels, but it's historically been dramatically underfunded relative to other types of solutions that are more popular with the stakeholders driving philanthropic activity in the space. So within climate, neglectedness refers loosely to systematic bias, and our own work is largely focused on applying leverage in the policy landscape to try to fix these funding imbalances. So neglectedness sort of starts that conversation. Right. And then we look to effective solutions in these problem areas that take a data and evidence-led approach, and we think about solving them. And so we sort of go through the pretty standard importance and tractability phases of the standard ITN process. And then we look to organizations implementing cost-effective interventions that have room for additional funding, and then make recommendations about which are most impactful. But we take different approaches based on different worldviews, and like others in this space, we have a 3 worldview approach. We care about current generations, and that's largely the kinds of things that global health and development charities you might think about focus on. We care about long-termism, which is the welfare of people and other creatures living in the long-term future, and animal welfare. And we do this sort of worldview diversification out of genuine moral uncertainty, and it's a strategy that we've adopted based on Open Philanthropy's worldview diversification framework.
Gotcha. I'm curious. How long does that evaluation process generally take? Is it kind of a quicker thing? Does it depend on the problem you're evaluating? How long does it generally take you guys to kind of come to a conclusion that something is a good idea?
It really varies. So we start by doing shallow investigations. If shallow investigations prove promising, we do medium depth investigations. And if they prove promising, then we do full cause area write-ups. I just came out of a meeting with one of our researchers, walking me through a medium investigation into an area we're considering, and she spent the last 3 months working on it, and it seems pretty promising. It will likely do a deeper dive cause area investigation. That's going to take another couple of months.
Yeah.
Before we even get to what are the funding opportunities in that space. And so, I'd guess if I had to put a range on it, somewhere between 3 and 8 months it takes to produce a piece of research that we're happy with, that we'll stand behind, that we're willing to put our high impact funding opportunity label on, and then recommend to our members to fund.
Gotcha. So it's a very robust process.
It's rigorous and pretty time intensive. And, there are ways to actually increase efficiency and decrease time spent on this stuff. But they're not super generalizable.
Got it. I want to back up a little bit and go back to the beginning kind of Founder's Pledge.
Yep.
David, what was the moment where you realized like something like this needed to exist? Was it like, you made like a big pot of cash and you're like, okay, how do I make the world better with this liquidity I've got? And you start looking around at charities and you're like, wow, like the nonprofit industrial complex is not exactly the best way to spend the money. I need to spend something else up. What did that kind of process look like?
Yeah. So I'd like to say that it was like way more strategic than it really was. But it wasn't. I was, like you say, I made a pot of cash, wanted to give it away. I felt like I'd gotten really lucky in life a bunch of times. Even though I didn't really think that I was growing up, that I was like, my family grew up very working class, and, I would have thought we were poor, but, as I got older and saw more of the world and really understood the place that I had in it, turned out to be like actually really, really very well off, like a white man born in California in the 1980s, like pretty good, sort of won the life lottery there. So I thought I've had some success in life. I've gotten really lucky a bunch of times. I should give money away. But as you say, the charity industrial complex seemed broken. And I didn't really understand what to do as a next step. But I definitely didn't have an education to speak of. And I thought, if I'm going to use my money well, I need to actually figure out how to think better first. Because I didn't have a good OS, right? Like I was street smart. I knew how to run a business. I knew, how to hustle. But I didn't really understand how to think systematically, methodologically, around big issues. And so my thinking was, I'm going to go get an education and actually learn how to think better. So I spent, 5 years, 6 years doing an undergrad and the start of a PhD. And by the time I, was into like the second year of my PhD program, I'd gotten itchy feet. I wasn't really sure, like I'd sort of lost track of like why I did this to begin with. The PhD felt like the next logical step, like it would really like take me to that next level. But I wasn't really sure what what the next level was going to be for me. And I sort of took a step back. I remember like I was up late one night. I was in my apartment and I was just like, I had really itchy feet. I was just like, I felt anxious. I'm like, what am I doing? I'm not sure why I'm going to spend the next 4 years studying international relations, and I don't know what I want to do next. I ended up going on the TED website, as one does late at night, to like be inspired by really interesting people who speak well about their journey. And I saw a TED Talk by Dan Pallotta, which was basically just the most brutal charity takedown I've ever seen. And he just like eviscerated the charity industrial complex through this lens of like, they just don't care about, like, donors don't care about efficiency. They want to feel good. And he walked through this story about just how ineffective and how hamstrung he was by donors and sort of outside interests. And it was really depressing, actually, and didn't make me feel any better. And then the next suggested TED Talk was by Jennifer Polka, who had started something called Code for America. And it was like the other side of that coin. It was this message of hope and this message of like, we have this amazing opportunity to leverage technology and technologists to make the world better. And she had this, and it was just like the most inspiring thing I'd seen. And I sort of decided after watching her TED Talk, like I started thinking about like, what journey have I been going on? Like, why did I decide to go to college and do PhD? And it was like, I wanted to think better about charity. And like, she just told me that there's a way to do this. And it's the intersection of technology, charity, and government. And I told my supervisor the next day that I'm not planning on continuing. I basically dropped out. And I decided at that point to work at this intersection, and found a foundation in the UK, in London. I was at Cambridge at the time, that was basically recruiting me. They like wrote a job spec for me to run this really interesting project, seemingly interesting project, that was the intersection of social entrepreneurs using technology to scale impact. And I just loved it. It was just like, oh, cool. I'm going to go try to emulate Jen Polka and help entrepreneurs build scalable, technology-empowered commercial solutions to impact-driven problems. And my job was to help people become more commercially viable, and it just didn't work. Like it didn't work. I spent a year on it, gave away £1 million of equity-free cash to 20 businesses, and it was a failure, basically. And it was like a useful failure because I learned a lot. And the moment that sort of Founders Pledge crystallized as a concept was, I'm focusing on the wrong user group, and I'm focusing on the wrong thing. I'm helping these social entrepreneurs try to be more commercially viable. And maybe I should just focus on great commercial entrepreneurs and help them to be more socially impactful. And maybe I should just solve the problem that I faced when I sold my business. What like started this whole journey that I went on, which is like, how do you actually give money away better? And by this point, GiveWell was well established. Effective altruism was this burgeoning community. I hadn't really become involved in it yet. And at the same time, we were seeing the Giving Pledge and this idea that like billionaires should and must give back of their success in some meaningful capacity. And it just felt like the right time to create positive social pressure on people who were going to be billionaires to get them to commit to give before they actually made their money, while they still were paper rich and seemingly generous, but at least had the potential for generosity and extreme earning potential. And so, Founders Pledge developed really quickly. Like that aha moment was April 2014. And by March 2015, it was live in the world.
That's great. I'm curious, you mentioned something interesting there, and that's, this idea of like, social entrepreneurship or something like that. And then there's like, making a lot of money and then doing good with it. So there's like, there's companies that can do good directly, like in the business context. And then there's companies that, you make a lot of money and you could do both, right? You can make a lot of money doing good and then give it away in a robust way. And then you get this kind of double whammy. But it does seem to be like there's a bit of a dichotomy between, something that's, in some sense helping with climate change, like a Tesla, and then something that's just like a high frequency trading, quant fund, which is more just like money making in some sense. Maybe there's some
or
like
ad tech, right?
Ad tech,
exactly. The notorious tech boogeyman, right? Like ad tech money.
That's great. Yes, absolutely. How do you think about coaching founders through this if they're building one of these companies in between, and how they can kind of maximize the most good they can do?
Yeah, that's a really good question. There aren't very many of these inherently world positive companies that also have huge, earning potential. I mean, I think Tesla is a really great example. Lots of ed tech sort of fits this bill. Climate tech fits this bill. Alternative protein and food tech fits this bill. In some cases, pharma fits this bill, but the rest of the sort of consumerist ecosystem of technology companies tends not to. And my view has been, and I've encouraged founders to just focus on having positive social, financial outcomes without necessarily harming the world, rather than doing trying to focus on doing good in it. I found that people who self-identify as social entrepreneurs tend to be, but not always are, less good at, the commercial outcomes than those who just focus on the commercial outcomes. And if they are social by dint of the area that they're working on, all the better for it. But the self-identified social entrepreneurs, tend, I think, to have slightly less good outcomes. So my advice to people when I get asked it is, focus on building a good business that doesn't harm the world actively, that makes a lot of money. And then once you've made that money, give the vast majority of it away to the very best stuff. And at that point, when you have, the FU capital, basically, you can go about doing things that sit at that intersection. And if we use Elon as a use case, and I think he's a good one here, if you take the human Elon out of the equation and you focus on Musk the entrepreneur, like why is he doing what he's doing? His arc is really interesting, and I think potentially something we can recreate, and certainly something we're attempting to do, which is, you have this guy started a business with a bunch of other white men, that became PayPal, that had a really good outcome, and that outcome gave him FU money, basically. And when he was very young in his career, and he had 50 to 70 years, I almost said 100 years, maybe he will, but 50 to 70 years of work life left. And he sort of stepped back and he said, okay, so what do I do now? Like, how do I spend my resources? How do I spend my time? And he ended up sort of coming to the conclusion that I should spend my time on things that are potentially harmful and detrimental to humanity's existence, our fragile existence. And he identified sort of 3 areas, right? Petrochemicals, the fact that we're living on one planet, and that one planet is susceptible to shocks, and AI, and built 3 companies around each of those 3 areas, truly bucking status quo and building commercial juggernauts that are also social businesses, in my view. And we can debate whether they're social businesses, or people will debate and may think differently. But in my view, like, absent Tesla, we don't have an electric car revolution. Battery tech isn't nearly where it's at. None of the changes that we're seeing in energy infrastructure really exist. Absent SpaceX, you still have a duopoly with the couple of bloated commercial players that haven't really innovated in a long time. And we aren't aiming for the stars again. And OpenAI has been an interesting journey, and Neuralink is the next version of that for Elon, right? Like all 3 companies, all very interesting, all aimed at making money, all aimed at doing good. I want to see more of that,
definitely.
But that arc is like make money and then go about using that money to like buck industries that are otherwise unhappy to allow people to change the status quo.
Definitely. That's super interesting. It's super interesting. It seems like you and Elon, you're similar in that, you got liquidity early, and that gave you like slack to be able to go and like solve like the problems you kind of like wanted to solve. And maybe you solved the problems you want to solve in the beginning as well. I'm not sure. I don't know the story. But do you think there's something important about that aspect of like, getting a big win, like kind of early, that gives you some amount of like slack to just like look at the entire picture and say, okay, like, what is important for me to solve?
Absolutely.
Gotcha.
I mean, it's why Founders Pledge is doing what Founders Pledge is doing, right? So there's, and I think that the people who've gone through the gauntlet of starting a business and having liquidity in that business, like that pressure cooker creates a different type of human than someone who inherits wealth. And that's not to say that the person who inherits wealth isn't a good person.
Right.
Many of them are, I'm sure.
Yeah.
But that gauntlet of like building something from scratch, matching it into existence, funding it sustainably or with venture capital, growing it to a scale, dealing with all of the human problems that one deals with in running a business, as well as like the commercial sides of it, the financial sides of it, the product sides of it. It creates different types of people. they're special, right? And that doesn't mean they're like special with, in a capital S, or exceptional in some way that isn't recreatable, but they're like different. And that type of person, I think, just is more able to sort of think outside and think bigger and think outside the box. And coupled with extreme wealth, it's a different sort of order of magnitude of ambition and willingness to try stuff, and risk taking. And I think that generally is a good thing. So like at Founders Pledge, we focus on people who are going to potentially be incredibly wealthy, and we start working with them 5 to 7 years ahead of that wealth actually materializing. So by the time they actually have liquidity, they're well positioned to think more strategically about how to deploy that capital to achieve maximum social impact. And that may not always be with charity. It always encompasses charity in some degree with Founders Pledge by the nature of what our commitment is. But our 1,800 members have pledged more than $8 billion, and their collective net wealth is in the many trillions. And what that means is this group of people has the ability to potentially like remake the world in a better way.
Definitely.
Or help to remake it in a better way. And for us, it's about coordination to solve those really tough problems and getting the right people connected in the right times.
Right.
To focus on the right stuff.
I'm curious, David, when an entrepreneur gets liquidity, a founder gets liquidity, and they come to you, and you don't have to like tell me how the sausage is made, so we can cut this if you don't want to talk about it. But like, do you just like do you give them a questionnaire? You're like, okay, like Will, you've done really well. What cause areas do you like? What do you want to look at? Or do you say like, hey, like we've kind of stack ranked these kind of interventions, and we think like this is the most tractable kind of underfunded thing. This is kind of the highest leverage thing you could do at this time. What does that kind of process look like? Or is it just kind of dynamic?
It's pretty dynamic, and depending upon the person and and where they're at, how much the kind of outcome they're looking at. And we've created some archetypes and some user types that we know how to service well. We'll work with them in different ways, but it typically starts with a conversation to understand what their ambitions are, what their timelines look like, and then we get into some of the specifics. And some people come to us fully formed with ideas. And they really just sort of want validation about like what within their ideas do we think makes the most sense, and we can give that, but that's not really our unique value proposition. Most of the people we tend to work with, we start by doing a values discovery session where we try to understand actually what are their sort of underlying intrinsic values that like allow them to make decisions in their day-to-day lives that they feel comfortable with, and how do those values map to philanthropic opportunities, and so we sort of try to translate those intrinsic values into areas of focus, and then within those areas of focus we stack rank and encourage people to do the most effective stuff. And at the end of the day, the reason we work with entrepreneurs is because entrepreneurs tend to follow data and tend to be more rational than your average person, though not always. And we present data that's compelling, and we present data that tells a story about like there are things that are way better than other things, and you should fund them.
Absolutely.
And when presented with information and the comparators between what they want to do and the outcomes that we expect from that, and what we suggest they do and the outcomes that we expect from that, it's a pretty straightforward decision.
That's good. And you've done this robust research, like you described, process to kind of vet everything. So like, you can give really good numbers there.
Yeah. I mean, we also partner with lots of other evaluators in the space, GiveWell, Open Philanthropy, Farm to Animal Funders, Happier Lives Institute, and lots of others who are just doing exceptional work. And we're not trying to recreate the wheel. Right. We're just trying to make sure all of the different wheels and cogs and gears fit together and make the watch tick at
That's good.
the right rate.
That's good. Another question here. If you look at the EA movement as a whole, what do you think it gets right? And what do you think it gets kind of less right? And I want to put an asterisk on this question that I think the EA movement is like probably the most self-reflective group of people I've been ever associated with. So, at some level, they do a really good job at this already. But what do you see that EA could do better?
Yeah. I think that sometimes EA suffers from like a communications deficit. Like you're right, one of the more self-reflective communities of people I've ever encountered. Some of the smartest people I've ever encountered. But sometimes, because it's a movement and it's a set of broad ideas, it's not a monolith, and so it's hard to communicate well as a movement that is so diverse in its thinking and so and so self-reflective. So there sometimes is just like a communication deficit, I think. What else do I think?
Is that toward the public?
So, yeah,
like to the broader public.
Yeah. So I think like EA is like generally, like the way EAs think is generally pretty much the way we should be thinking about most of these things. And if we want more people to, join that movement, it needs to be palatable to them. And often it's not. Or people develop knee-jerk reactions to some of the language that's used to talk about things, feel that it's heartless, and essentially develop very knee-jerk views that are hard to dispel and propagate. So I think, most people, in any case, when asked to buy into the basic premises of EA, do. And yes, they believe a life in Malawi is as worth as much as a life in Minneapolis or wherever it is. Yes, that they believe that we should use data and evidence in figuring out how to do good, but they sometimes balk at the conclusions that these premises entail, maybe. And I think that for many people who haven't really sort of rigorously got into studying this, giving is very emotional. And I'm not sure that like EA is good at taking that emotional response and turning it into something rational and sort of and impactful. I'm not sure how to sort of put that, but there's like the emotional givers just seem not to resonate with EA, and I wish they could. And maybe that's a lack of storytelling. I'm not sure.
Right. So maybe we can tell like more compelling stories about how EA is helping instead of, because there's trade-off when you quantify things, it's perhaps less compelling, but then you want to also be able to, like sell this to people. You want to communicate this to people, and you need to make it palatable to everyone across the political spectrum. And
I think that that's right. I don't think EA gets a huge amount wrong. I mean, there is something to be said about is a movement generally of white men. Although it's getting better, we're seeing more diversity in it. The pushback that I've gotten, or the critiques that I've heard, have tended to be around most of the people, especially in this global health and development space and current generation focus, don't have much field experience and don't have any real context for what they recommend. So they're like, academics straight out of university who can sort of run cost effectiveness analyses and have sort of statistics at their disposal and do regression analyses and do all the sort of the academic stuff, but don't really understand what it's like on the ground running an organization. And as a result, will never get it right until they do.
Simple legibility problems.
Yeah. I've heard that a lot. And I think, there's some truth in it. There really is. And until you run an organization, it's really hard to understand the complexity of running an organization, and sort of the unexpectedness, that was sort of what am I trying to say? And how things happen that are just so outside the realm of what you expect that you have to deal with. And this is just sort of part and parcel of every organization, even the really well-run ones.
That's what happens.
I think maybe EA would do well to have some more operational experience in its core.
Got it. That makes sense. I think it's good. That's a really good critique. David, I got another question here.
Sure.
You've got a background in real estate, finance, and housing. Housing affordability, it's a big problem lately. I'm a big Georgist. I won a grant from Scott Alexander back in January with my friend to help implement, land value tax. I'm also interested in the YIMBY movement. How do you think about fixing the housing crisis? What interventions are you particularly interested in? And have you guys looked much at housing as a space?
We have. I am not super well versed on our housing affordability report at the moment, unfortunately, though. So we have written a housing affordability report. It is on our website, and I've just pulled up the summary now. And it's a focus on England, and it's from 2020. So I'm not really unfortunately well versed enough to speak about it, but we have suggested as one of our recommended funding opportunities London YIMBY, which is trying to improve housing policy in England, and it's using a seemingly novel approach that focuses on overcoming political economy challenges.
Cool.
Yeah,
that's awesome. Well, David, are you down for a round of overrated and underrated?
Sure, let's do it.
So I'll throw out a term. You'll just tell me whether it's overrated or underrated.
Okay.
So the first one, I think you already answered this, but I'll throw it out there anyway. AI X-Risk, is it overrated or underrated? Let's say by the general public.
Underrated.
Underrated. That's good.
Vastly
and why?
Underrated.
Why do you think it is? Just not exposure? Can't quite grok what's going on?
People, when they hear about AI risk, think Terminator and don't really, and then write it off as science fiction.
Gotcha.
And also just don't understand, I think, the speed the speed of development and just like what the risk really entails.
Do you put
and it feels really far off to lots of people.
It does. It still feels quite far off to me, but the I always mispronounce it. The prediction markets, meticulous. They have it very. It just it moved up a lot with DALL-E, and it's 15 years away? I believe right now. It's really close.
It might even be less than that.
Might be less than that. Do you think that's? Do you think that's all the money? Do you think that's aggressive? Do you think that's? It'll take longer.
I literally don't know. I'm not an expert in this. Most of the people who I talk to who are experts think that it's probably pretty close to right.
Gotcha.
I was at a talk the other day, and I can't attribute who said it, but an organization is working on, is working on a sub 10-year timeline for general AI, and it's one of the big ones.
Wow.
And the guy talking about it very casually, just guy or girl, very casually mentioned that, we expect in less than 10 years we'll have a weak general AI.
Wow. That's
and
horrifying.
I was like, oh, that's pretty horrifying. And I went, cried in a corner and had a drink.
Exactly. But that's what we can do. Investing to give, overrated or underrated?
Underrated. Yeah, we just published a report and set up a new fund, the Patient Philanthropy Fund, that is investing to give on a couple 100-year timeline. The brilliant Shear, who I never pronounced his last name right, Hugh Makers, who's just left Founders Pledge to join Giving What We Can as their head of research, spearheaded this wonderful initiative to get people to invest to give over the long term, focusing on X risks. So we launched that at the end of last year, I believe, if memory serves me. We brought in nearly $2 million for it so far, and have a great momentum as we look to raise more. But certainly underrated.
Is that just because you can get excess, you get these returns that compile over time, and there's just such a large cash
with a long enough time horizon, like markets point in one direction, and if you have the capacity to draw down capital rapidly, as and when you have sort of very hingy moments, it's hard to see why you wouldn't invest to give it with at least some of your philanthropy.
Got it. Do you think there are any,
or just personal capital?
Right. Do you think there are challenges with like maintaining, large pools of capital like over time and have them be directed to the purpose they were intended to? I'm sure it goes into the report, but
it is in the report. We've looked into it pretty extensively. This tends not to be a problem with with large pots of money because of how they were set up and the sort of founding constitutional documents. They're trusts and foundations that are hundreds and hundreds of years old that
cool.
are still focused on the very specific thing. In some cases to their detriment, because that specific thing no longer exists as an issue, and they have so much money that they can't actually do anything with because of how the organization was set up. But I think we've drafted our founding documents for the Patient Philanthropy Fund, which is an independent entity licensed by the UK Charity Commission, to be more flexible.
Very cool. Very cool. One last one. Direct cash transfers. Sure. Overrated or underrated?
I think it's rated appropriately. I'm gonna create a third category. I don't think it's either. I mean, if you can't do better than direct cash transfers, do direct cash transfers. Still, too many people intermediate with organizations that are unnecessary.
Right.
So, but again, lots of development agencies focus on direct cash transfers already. So I wouldn't call it either. I mean, I'd rather people give directly than Oxfam, for example.
That's good. Well, David, thank you so much for coming on the show. I really enjoyed talking to you today.
My pleasure.
Where can people find you? Where can people find Founders Pledge? Where should we send them?
Our website, founderspledge.com. All of our research is public. All of our giving recommendations are on our website. If you're based in the U.S. and you want to give to any of our top charities, you can do so with every.org. Just search for Founders Pledge. We have a profile there and a bunch of different pooled funds. And if you're in the UK, you can go to EA Funds, and we have our climate fund there, as well as a couple of others. And our website. So if you have questions, if you're an entrepreneur, please do feel free to send us an email or reach out via our web form.
Awesome. Thanks, David.
My pleasure. Thanks, Will.
Special thanks to our sponsor, Bismarck Analysis, for the support. Bismarck Analysis creates the Bismarck Brief, a newsletter about intelligence-grade analysis of key industries, organizations, and live players. You can subscribe to Bismarck Brief at brief.bismarckanalysis.com. Thanks for listening. We'll be back next week with a new episode of Narratives. Special thanks to Donovan Dorrance, our audio editor. You can check out Donovan's work and music at donovandorrance.com.